Hypothesis test conclusions. The two possible outcomes are reject HO, which is reject the null hypothesis, and fail to reject HO, fail to reject the null hypothesis. So there are only two conclusions to a hypothesis test. It's either going to be this one or this one, nothing else. When you reject HO, it means that we have data that can refute the claim put forth in the null hypothesis. Comparing this to the judicial system, rejecting HO is like saying that the individual is guilty. It means that our sample evidence was strong enough to refute what was stated in the null hypothesis. Failing to reject HO, the other type of conclusion, means that our data isn't strong enough to reject the null hypothesis. Comparing this to the judicial system, failing to reject HO is like saying the individual on trial is not guilty. Okay, so means that our sample evidence isn't strong enough to reject what the null hypothesis stated. So remember that we made the assumption that the defendant was or the individual is not guilty. If our sample evidence isn't strong enough, then we continue to say that the individual is not guilty. And that's what failing to reject HO means. Okay, so rejecting the null hypothesis means our sample data is strong. Essentially, it means that when we compare our p-value to alpha, the p-value is less than alpha. It means that we can refute the claim made about the population in the null hypothesis. It means that the defendant is guilty. And if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, it means our sample data is weak. It means the p-value is greater than alpha. It means that we can't refute the claim that was made in the null hypothesis, HO. And it means that the defendant is not guilty. So you either say reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis. Those are the two conclusions that you could make in a hypothesis test. Even though the result of a hypothesis test is fail to reject HO or fail to reject the null hypothesis, it's not the same as saying accept the null hypothesis. It's not correct to accept the null hypothesis because there may be other samples when tested that enable us to reject the null hypothesis. Similarly, if there is not enough evidence to prove an individual guilty, we say not guilty. So we never say the individual is innocent. So just as there is a difference between not guilty and innocent, there's a difference between failing to reject HO and accepting HO. So it would be incorrect to state accept HO in the conclusion of a hypothesis test.